Will you pray with me? Loving and gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. I suppose that if you were alive on September 11th, 2001, you, like me, remember where you were and what you were doing. I was a teacher, a high school language teacher, and when we first started getting the news of what had happened, I believe we were in second period, because by 9 a.m. we had already had 1 hour and a half long period starting at 7:30. We had these small TVs mounted in our classrooms that played this Channel 1 news source. Yeah, do you remember this? Yeah, I see other teachers nodding. And that was kind of cutting edge in 2001, that we had these TVs that were like wired to cable and everything throughout our whole school. And there was this moment that happened, I don't remember how, maybe it was a PA announcement, because this was before we had individual phones in our classrooms, and we were told to turn on our TVs. And that second period was sort of a homeroom period for us. It was a little short period where we had kids from, we weren't necessarily teaching, but they were sort of our home-based kids. So we did. And one of the kids that I had in my homeroom had been assigned to me on purpose. She was our exchange student from France. And her English was really good, but it wasn't perfect, and so they thought that having her in my class for homeroom, I could translate, I could do whatever she needed because I was the French teacher. And so there she was with all of us watching this thing happen, and she had been in the United States for maybe 2-3 weeks at that moment because it was so early, in the year. So at some moment, we turned on those tiny TV monitors, and none of us were prepared to interpret these live action events for our students, much less for a student who was here from a different country. So I had this room full of kids. Well, not kids, but we always called them that, right? I had this room full of teenagers that were watching, along with me, this horrific event. And I was supposed to know what to say, what to do. I know that at the time there were parents calling, there was all kinds of other stuff going on. But when you're a teacher and you're the person in the classroom with the kids, it's sort of a hermetically sealed environment. They're yours. They're yours in that moment. They just are. And whatever else is happening around you, those are your kids. What everyone was speculating about what the next targets would be, these are my kids, and would we be a target because we lived in a county that was right next to a nuclear power plant. And so my kids were actually really smart. They were really thinking things through. Okay, if people are targeting these different places, could we be a target? We began to understand, though, that it was over in the sense that there were no more targets that day. The Pentagon, Pennsylvania, the Trade Center, that was it. I had Elodie, my exchange student, back with me by my desk, and we talked constantly. I was constantly sort of trying to interpret the news for her, trying to tell her what was happening. And I asked, as we continued throughout the day, because we all stayed where we were. We didn't try to have school or classes or anything else. Have you been able to talk to your parents? Do they know you're okay? And it was really interesting to me how much calmer Elodie and her parents were than I was. It was like perhaps living in France, they understood that those who have been colonized and manipulated by other countries in games of global superpowers, that there would of course be repercussions. I finally helped her find a way to connect to her parents. This was way before Skype and video chatting and all the things that we can do so easily across countries and everything now. And she told me that they were not demanding that she come home immediately, which honestly we know wouldn't have been possible, but it was so interesting to me that they said, sure, you should stay, and they trusted that she would be fine with her host family throughout this unprecedented, at least unprecedented for us in the US, event. As the days went on, I communicated with the 17-year-old's parents, Elodie's parents, and her host family did as well, and so did she. And we began to realize how different the response would be for those of us in the US who had never really considered that we could be attacked, that our people could die because of what other people thought of us. France had had to reckon for a long time with the effects of their colonization of North and Western Africa. They had had to deal with refugees and immigrants and so many things. And they hadn't necessarily done a good job. But it was part and parcel of what it meant to be French. You had to deal with what your country had done as colonizers and how unjust it had been. But we in the U.S. had never really reckoned with our colonialist history. We hadn't reckoned with the fact that we propped up fascist, authoritarian dictators in the Middle East because of our oil and economic interests there. And we were never really honest about our role in the instability and the fomenting of terrorism in the Middle East. And then suddenly on September 11th, 2001, we experienced the kind of destabilization, the kind of terrorism, the kind of fear and death that so much of the world already understood. And we weren't ready to admit that maybe some of the things that we had done as a country could have contributed to that event. We wanted to be pure victims, right? But there's really no such thing ever. Nobody is ever a pure victim. See, here's the thing. James tells us that our faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful activity. And it's not that we have to earn our faith, but that our faith will naturally result in activity that is just and faithful and helps bring about justice in the world. That's just what faith in Jesus, that's just what following Jesus does. It brings forth justice. Faith, it's not some esoteric thing. It's not some out there, can't feel it or touch it thing. No, James says faith is what gives food to the hungry and clothes the naked and cares for those who need it. I think of those who on 9/11 put their faith into action by helping their coworkers get down flights and flights and flights of stairs. I think of the rescue workers who went into buildings when everything said don't and helped people escape. I think, well, I don't know that I can really think, I don't know that I can really imagine it, of all the people who helped others survive and all of those who didn't. See, this passage in James asks the really good question. What good is it if you don't actually give people what their body needs? What good is your faith if you don't give people what their body needs? This reminds us that faith isn't some concept that's just in our minds and hearts. It's giving each other what we need. That's why we organize to give meals to folks when they're sick in the congregation. Their bodies need food. That's why we have Food for the Soul, to deliver groceries to people who are HIV positive and can't get groceries. Their bodies need food. That's why we miss hugging each other so much. Or maybe that's just me. Our bodies need to express their love for one another. That's why we have marriage ceremonies where the couple shows up together to proclaim their love. Their bodies need us helping them proclaim that these two people fell in love with each other and desire the support of their community. This body and soul expression of faith is what our rites and sacraments are all about. They are an enacting in our bodies of what is a reality in our souls, like marriage, but also like baptism. When we pour water over someone's head, it means that we are bringing them into the community that we are part of, the community that believes that following Jesus is important yesterday, today, and always. When we take communion here every Sunday, we are proclaiming with our bodies something that is a reality in our souls. Jesus gave his body for us, and every time we celebrate communion, we honor that reality. This is the core tenet of our faith as Christians. It's not just about belief, it's about a God who loves us so much that they came in human form to dwell among us. Our God knows what grief feels like. Our God knows what hunger feels like. Our God knows what desire feels like. Our God knows what love is. And because our God has experienced those things, our God knows us, body and soul. God reminds us to celebrate ourselves, body and soul. And our God also reminds us that if we want to follow God, we must do it not just with our minds, but with our bodies and our souls. We can proclaim our belief all we want, but we must also show that belief in action. And so I ask you, my friends, how is it that we are manifesting God's love in tangible ways in this particular moment? Is it with a phone call to someone we are missing? Is it with a meal to someone who needs it? Is it in remembering and honoring the beautiful and the hard moments in our lives, in other people's lives? Is it in reaching out just because you've thought of that person and, you haven't heard from them for a while? How do we enact James's admonition to give people what their bodies actually need? Well, friends, we know how to do that, right? And maybe it's different right now during the pandemic and the Delta variant and all the things, but what James taught us still remains true. Our faith is not just about verbal assent or believing the right things. Our faith is concerned with real people, real bodies, real feelings. This weekend, as we have honored and remembered the 20 years since 9/11, let us honor all the ways, large and small, that we care for one another. Let us admit that we're not blameless. Let us acknowledge the death toll of a 20-year war in Afghanistan. Let us mourn not only the dead in the U.S., but the dead around the world because of terrorism. And let us honor the bodies of those who will never go home again. The bodies who are loved and mourned and grieved, and who are precious to God. Those who died then, those who have died in COVID, those who have died. And let us continue to pray for God's true peace, true shalom in the world, which is not just the absence of war, but the presence of God's loving and just realm on earth.